If you thought 2024 was bad, then just wait for 2025. It's going to be a crazy year, and I have some crisis areas that we're going to take a close look at to see just why. Why will 2025 be a massive year geopolitically for the world? After all, why should you care about any of the conflicts going on around the world whenever they don't necessarily impact your ability to already fail on your fitness goals by the end of January? Well, we'll talk about it. First and foremost is probably the most obvious crisis area, and that of course is the war in Ukraine. This is not a new space, especially for frequent viewers of this channel. You know that we talk about this conflict quite a lot. And I've also already spoken about the challenge areas going in for both sides heading into the new year. However, 2025 is shaping up to be a different kind of year for this conflict from past years. I've already spoken more in depth in a past video about why we're likely to see a ceasefire or some sort of a pause in the fighting sometime this year. However, today I'm going to posit that we won't see a ceasefire and this war is just going to continue on. And the reasoning for this statement is that both sides haven't moved politically from their original positions from the start of the war. And that's not me abandoning, my position in the previous video. This is just an intellectual exercise for the purposes of this video. But it is true that neither side has really moved from their political positions and their goals for this conflict that they had from the start of this war. For Russia, it's the replacement of the Zelensky government and the positioning of a pro-Russian government in Kiev. And for Ukraine, this is really a sort of a war of independence from Russia. They're fighting to protect their homes and their democratic freedoms from Russian interference that they fought and got during the 2014 Maidan Revolution and during revolutions past. Even if both sides sat down today to discuss a ceasefire, I think they would have a very difficult time coming up with an agreement. And Ukraine may reasonably feel that a ceasefire would not be in their best interest. In fact, it would be more advantageous for Russia to have a ceasefire than for Ukraine. After all, Russia has a history of violating past agreements with Ukraine, whether that's the Budapest Memorandum or the Minsk agreements. And a ceasefire would also benefit Russia by giving it time to rearm and refit its military to launch fresh offensives once the ceasefire has expired or shortly before it's expired. Ukraine's not necessarily in a position to capitalize on a ceasefire the same way that Russia is. It doesn't have the defense industrial base. Its support from the West may not be sufficient to rearm its military, and it may not be able to get the bodies and uniform that it really desperately needs right now that Russia is able to do. So Ukraine may actually feel that going without a ceasefire may actually be more beneficial as it waits for economic challenges in Russia to fully manifest into a crisis or other kinds of issues in Russia, such as political issues that impact Russian mobilization and other kinds of challenges that Putin's facing. They're just kind of waiting out the clock right now. That's not exactly a crazy position to take, so if you want more information on that, go check out that past. What has been a huge challenge for Ukraine has definitely been manpower. According to a recent thread by Michael Kaufman, Western aid has more or less resolved the problem areas in terms of material, equipment, and ammunition. However, personnel is something that really only Ukraine can deal with, and thus far they haven't managed to find a solution. According to him, Ukrainians are willing to serve only in support roles, and they don't want to be infantry. And so to resolve this issue, Ukraine's having to pull specialized and specially trained soldiers from other areas of their army, whether they're, drone warfare specialists or they're crews for armored vehicles, like for Bradley fighting vehicles, and transitioning them into infantry roles. Ukraine having to cannibalize highly specialized troops and put them into infantry roles is a big problem because it takes a lot of time to train a soldier up to be an FPV drone specialist or to be a crew member for a tank or something. Losing those troops in the front lines and in trenches is definitely not the way that Ukraine would want to be spending those troops, especially whenever the firepower, whenever that crew is in a tank or an IFV, is certainly more helpful for Ukraine. However, at the rate that Ukraine is losing troops and with the struggles that Ukraine is having and getting new troops into uniform, they really have few options here. One of the things that emerged this past year in 2024 was the idea that European countries could indeed send troops to assist Ukraine in this conflict, at least on an individual basis. Whether that's in the form of sending combat troops to actually partake in combat operations, that does not at all appear likely. However, they could send troops in the form of border security or other kinds of support personnel to handle different kinds of security jobs within Ukraine that would allow Ukraine to free up their security staff on the western half of Ukraine and send them east to fight in the conflict. This still appears a little unlikely at this time. However, that is certainly an option that has been discussed, especially with the French and the Poles. And all of that gets much more interesting and complicated whenever you factor in the inclusion of North Korean combat personnel in this conflict. While before, this war was just a conflict between two different combatant states, Ukraine and Russia. However, now Russia has roped in both Iranian support, which kind of is in line with Western support for Ukraine, but they've also roped in North Korean support in the form of combat troops, which is an escalatory step past Western aid for Ukraine. This sets a precedent that Europe could use. So whereas before European military aid in the form of combat troops or in the form of just military personnel to Ukraine might have been extremely unlikely, now that North Korean troops are in Europe partaking in this war on Russia's side and fighting and dying for Russia, that definitely increases the likelihood that some European countries like, again, France or Poland could decide to take matters into their own hands. And all of this ties back into the topic of a ceasefire, because one of Ukraine's goals and necessities really at this point is security guarantees. This is whether Ukraine goes for a peace agreement or a ceasefire. It needs security guarantees from somebody that can carry them out that's not obviously Russia. And they're not likely to agree to anything without them. Of course, Ukraine would prefer the United States. However, I would imagine some European countries that have the capability of enforcing a ceasefire that Russia would really have to take a pause and think about violating a ceasefire if their troops are there. That would probably be sufficient. So all that is to say that a ceasefire would likely have to include the insertion of European troops of some sort along the line of contact in Ukraine to enforce the ceasefire. Then if Russia chose to violate the ceasefire, it would have to consider the risk of potentially damaging or injuring or killing European troops that are not Ukrainian in that ceasefire violation. And that, of course, could risk a wider conflict with that other European nation. Whatever Russia thinks that it can get out of Ukraine just fighting by Ukraine itself, it'll certainly be much harder if it's also having to balance a fight against Poland or France, or both at the same time. Now, looking at the battlefield here, 2025 has begun with the war heating up in a way. Russia has continued its offensives in Kursk, Kharkiv, and towards Chasiv Yar and Pokrovsk. There's also been some reports that Ukraine launched a small offensive in Kursk. However, I haven't really seen enough to see that that was a sustained offensive, so we'll just leave it at that. However, with Russia's offensive, they've been able to gain more and more territory month after month, at least up until the winter months. This is due to increased operational tempo and also due to increased Ukrainian losses and the difficulties Ukraine is having defending its actual territory, especially in Donetsk. However, winter has set in and that has slowed down Russia's rate of operations just because of the mud season. So they'll have another window of time here soon during the winter time whenever the ground freezes again, but then during springtime whenever the ground gets muddy once more, that will likely slow things down again until summertime. The longer this war goes on, the more the economic impact of this conflict is going to make its impact on the rest of the world as well. We've already discussed in past videos how Ukraine's agricultural output has taken significant impacts from this conflict and its ability to not only produce grain but also to export it to the rest of the world, and that's impacted countries in Africa and Asia. Russia has attempted to fill that gap and has to a large extent managed to do just that. However, the threat of Ukrainian strikes on Russian shipping in the Black Sea, for example, definitely poses some threats to Russia's ability to export grain themselves. And so other countries have had to step up and fill the gap, like, for example, Uncle Sam. Typically, China makes up the bulk of U.S. grain exports, especially to Asia. However, China has been lessening its imports of U.S. grain in recent years. But even despite that, in 2023 and 2024, the U.S. has been posting multi-year highs in grain exports, even without China, thanks to imports to, say, Morocco and other parts in Africa and Asia. So overall, looking at Ukraine, 2025 starts with the war in Ukraine continuing to escalate, but at least with talks on the table. Whether or not those talks amount to anything is what 2025 is going to show us. We're going to definitely see this year. But pair the talks with an election result in 2024, pair all of this with the new election coming soon this month in Belarus, which, if you remember the 2020 election in Belarus, it was definitely domestically tumultuous for Belarus. You pair that with the election results here in the United States and the change in policy from the new incoming Trump administration, there's going to be a lot of transition in Europe here coming up very soon, and that is all going to make a thumbprint in this conflict very quickly. 2025 won't just directly impact the war in Ukraine, it may also impact whether or not we have a war in Taiwan. Throughout the past few years, China has conducted massive aerial and naval drills around Taiwan. These drills have increased in size, scope, and complexity over time, and the intent is pretty clear. These are all just a massive rehearsal for an actual conventional invasion of Taiwan. China is motivated to handle Taiwan sooner rather than later as well, and that opens up the door for 2025 to be at least one of the first years in this window that we may see them actually make a move on Taiwan. This is for a few few reasons. First, Xi Jinping has to balance several internal political, economic, and social challenges that do put pressure for a move on Taiwan sooner rather than later. China's post-COVID recovery has posed some significant economic challenges for China, with weak consumer spending and struggles in exports. One factor in this challenge has also been the war in Ukraine, where China has supported Russia, and that has brought about Western attention on China and the looming threat of economic sanctions on the Chinese economy, as well as secondary sanctions on certain Chinese banks that have supported Russia. This, of course, greatly compounds once Trump enters into office. And all of this has impacts on things like foreign investment, exports, and China's diplomatic capabilities and flexibility. China is also heavily threatened and riddled with debt, both on the public and the private sides. From private debt held by major Chinese corporations to debt held by the Chinese government, nobody really knows exactly what the size of this debt really is, and that's thanks to shadow banking. Shadow banking is basically where unregulated banks lend money, but where they're not required to report how much money they're lending, and this way companies don't necessarily have to put that on their reporting, and that, of course, reduces the impact on their liability sheet. As a result, they end up taking on debt, but nobody knows exactly how much debt they've taken on. This is a major risk to the Chinese economy, especially in China's real estate sector, which makes up about 20 to 30% of China's GDP, depending on how it's measured. This is all, of course, highlighted with the recent collapse of Evergrande in 2023, which was one of China's largest real estate developers. China has long subsidized private real estate development, basically allowing them to take out loans from the government and continue to build real estate projects around China. But there's some loose ends to this regulation where companies really just have to have an ongoing real estate project. As long as they build something, they can pull the subsidy. That's led to massive ghost cities where you have a bunch of apartment buildings built in the middle of nowhere or some place where people are not going to be moving to anytime soon. And these buildings are built with shoddy material, and they really start to fall apart after just a few years. I've actually been to a couple ghost cities whenever I studied in China. I saw some of these buildings in the middle of Qingdao that had been built 10 years ago, but they had just built like the shell of the building and they didn't plan on necessarily finishing the building. But because they had at least built the shell and they were still under construction, the company was still able to pull the subsidy. This has all created a real estate bubble that has yet to fully pop. But the debt held by these companies could be the pin that pops that bubble. And once that bubble does pop, China's going to have some massive problems economically. Of course, all of this threatens Xi Jinping's goal of transforming the Chinese economy from an export and investment model to a domestic consumption economy similar to what the United States has. Following COVID, people feel less inclined or able to buy. And with a high youth unemployment rate that stands to the upper teens to around 20% over the past few years now, this all comes with a youth protest called Lying Flat, where many young people in China feel like they just don't have the opportunity, or they don't necessarily see really why they're doing a lot of the hard work that they're doing, and they don't really agree with the excessive work culture that is found in many high-profile Chinese companies called 996, which means 9 p.m. to 6 p.m., 6 days a week. They also feel frustrated with the consumerism that they're seeing growing in Chinese culture, again, brought about by Xi Jinping's prioritization of more domestic consumerism. And so all of this has brought about the youth protest movement of Lying Flat, where they just don't overwork, where they live a minimalist life, they don't overconsume, which sounds not too bad, but still it's a large threat to Xi Jinping's vision and model for how he wants the Chinese economy to transition into. A lot of young people in this movement in China are also protesting the lack of social mobility. A lot of young people in China haven't exactly bought into the Chinese dream, or what Xi Jinping envisions as the Chinese dream for, Chinese citizens moving forward. And this all is going to sound very familiar, especially for Americans and the American dream. It's about having home ownership, having family responsibilities and hard work. Young people feel like they can't buy homes. They feel like they're working really hard, but they're really just making rich people richer, and they're not really getting the economic benefits for themselves. So as a response, they're either deliberately remaining unemployed, or they're just not taking overtime. They're working more just like the 8-hour workday, not a full 12-hour workday, and they're not buying things that they don't need to have. All of this is a massive problem for Xi Jinping because not only does he want the economy to transition to a domestic consumer model, he needs the youth specifically to be the main driver of this movement. China is facing a demographic crisis where a significant size of their population will be reaching retirement age within the next 10 years. In fact, already this year it's estimated that around 20% of China's population is over the age of 60. These folks not only are less able to work certain jobs, they're also coming with increased costs to China's medical system. This is further exacerbated by China's lowering fertility rate and the impact of China's one-child policy. Today, China has significantly more males than it does females. That's led to a massive problem where a lot of males are finding that they just don't have anybody left to marry. The declining birth rate, the aging population, the slowdown in the economy means that the Chinese economy will have to do more with a lot less. And while that is perfectly feasible, that can be done, it's just going to mean an even deeper economic transition than what probably Xi Jinping originally had envisioned. And this, of course, is while a lot of young Chinese workers are finding less fulfillment in their work and they're struggling to really kind of see a point in any of this. All of that is just some of the difficulties that Xi Jinping has to navigate domestically. However, whenever it comes to Taiwan, Xi Jinping has even more challenges that he has to navigate diplomatically and militarily and strategically. For example, he has to deal with the United States' relationship with Taiwan and how the United States is prepared for Taiwan. The U.S. has spent decades concerned about a war in Taiwan. However, the war in Ukraine has shown that interstate warfare is definitely not just a reality, but it is probably inevitable in some cases. So the U.S. has been forced to reconsider its strategic position in East Asia and exactly what its strategy is to contain China. And that's led to tighter diplomatic relationships with South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, New Zealand, Australia, and more. Where in Europe, the U.S. has NATO, and NATO's really, in a way, able to stand up to Russia on its own, independent of significant U.S. help, at least today. East Asia does not have an equivalent. It will require significant U.S. investment to really keep China from breaching the first island chain. Should China manage to take Taiwan, it'll have a free shot into the deeper Pacific, which would allow it access not only to Hawaii and Alaska, but to the western U.S. coastline. If World War II taught the United States anything, it's that that's not only a massive security threat, it's also very difficult to reverse. So the U.S. position has basically been the reverse of what it did in World War II, whereas in World War II it was island hopping and taking islands from Japan and brutal island warfare. In this case, the U.S. is setting up an island defense network similar to what Japan had, and basically just trying to increase the cost for each island that China would have to get through the first island chain. And of course, diplomatically speaking, the weakest link in that chain is Taiwan. Taiwan is its own country. However, if you're most of the world and you want to sell Marvel action figures to China, it's its own breakaway province of China. So while the U.S. has been able to navigate a stronger strategy with other countries, it really has to kind of tiptoe on the line with Taiwan so it doesn't anger Beijing in a significant way. However, of course, Taiwan is a pretty large island and it may be a tough nut to crack. And that's not to say that Taiwan doesn't want or desperately need U.S. assistance even right now before a conflict begins. Taiwan has long sought U.S. aid and assistance in developing its defense infrastructure and preparing it for a conflict. And guess what? The U.S. has had a lot of capabilities to bring to the table for Taiwan. However, in doing so, they've risked the anger of China, which is in some cases triggered these massive war games that we've seen. And so Xi Jinping knows that the longer he waits to act on Taiwan, the more time the U.S. and Taiwan has to develop its defensive position around the island. And that is very problematic, especially considering that Taiwan will be a tough fight. And for more on why Taiwan's going to be so difficult to take, I've actually got a couple of videos that I made a while ago discussing why it will be difficult for China to take Taiwan and why it will, China may have an easier time taking Taiwan. Militarily, China's also really racing against the clock right now. While it's managed to grow its force and its navy to the largest navy in the world in terms of ship count, as well as a heavily modernized force, it's deployed 3 different aircraft carriers, or at least 2 of which are domestically produced and domestically designed Chinese variants, with potentially more aircraft carriers on the way. China has been in a race to really kind of match the United States in terms of naval size and capability and in its army size and capability. One of the real issues for China is the new Trump administration and the increased attention that Trump will be bringing on China. To Trump, China is the primary security threat to the United States, not Russia or any other country. This, of course, led to increased U.S. presence and focus on Taiwan during his first administration and would likely see a redo during his second administration. And Trump is, of course, likely to take a hardline stance on China. And all of this, of course, runs directly in the face of Xi Jinping's goal to take Taiwan by 2027. Of course, Trump's term ends in 2028. So either Xi Jinping can risk Trump's wrath and attempts to take Taiwan during his administration, or he thinks about waiting until the end of Trump's administration to try to take Taiwan and really just rolling the dice to see who the next U.S. president would be, and really hoping that Trump doesn't do too much damage to China's risk profile in taking Taiwan during this next 4 years. Or, of course, he just tries to beat Trump to the punch and tries taking Taiwan by January 20th. But, of course, that's not very likely for a number of reasons. One, we haven't seen any indication that that's going to happen. I'm recording this on the 7th, so we probably would have seen something by now. But also the Strait of Taiwan, it really isn't suitable for significant naval movement, especially the sustainment of a massive amphibious military operation that will require hundreds of ships and hundreds of thousands of troops navigating that strait. Really until April to May, whenever the winds kind of cool down, as well as September to October. Outside of those months, the waters are choppy and it's very difficult to traverse. Rougher sea conditions is certainly not ideal whenever you're also considering the threat of anti-ship ballistic missiles and an air threat. Xi Jinping may have a better chance of taking Taiwan while the U.S. is still balancing crises in Europe and the Middle East. However, they may have likely already lost their most optimal window of opportunity, which would have been around last year, 2023, whenever the war in Ukraine had just popped off, and especially whenever the war in the Middle East kicked off. 2025 could see Xi Jinping acting increasingly desperate or really willing to test Trump's willingness to engage in a fight over Taiwan. In either case, all eyes are on Taiwan and China for 2025. 2025 began, but the wars in the Middle East certainly did not end. Israel is still at war in Gaza, with a ceasefire in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah hanging on by a thread, but that of course expires by January 26th. The war in Gaza is likely to continue to rage on a lot longer, at least until either Israel is able to rescue the remaining hostages or Hamas frees the remaining hostages. But the situation in Lebanon certainly is a lot more interesting. Since Israel and Hezbollah struck a ceasefire, there have been multiple violations from both sides, with Lebanon reporting to the UN Security Council over 800 air and ground attacks from Israel on Hezbollah positions, and of course several rocket attacks from Hezbollah into Israel. Israel has not only accused Hezbollah of firing rockets into Israel, they've also accused them of not withdrawing their military equipment to north of the Litani River as agreed. Things have also significantly changed for Hezbollah strategically since the ceasefire came into force. Of course, Syria has undergone a pretty significant change in management, from Assad, who facilitated the Iranian support of Hezbollah, to HTS, which very much does not have a good relationship with Hezbollah or Iran. We're going to talk about Syria more in a moment, because boy, that's a can of worms that matters for 2025 that really requires its own little section in this video. However, with Assad gone, it's going to be a lot harder for Iran to get military aid to Hezbollah. Corridor through Syria basically cut off, meaning that the already massively weakened Hezbollah may be on their own if a ceasefire deal breaks down with Israel. And whether Israel chooses to capitalize on this opportunity by outright destroying Hezbollah, really by invading the rest of Lebanon, that's really up to them. Not likely, because if they were going to do that, we probably would have seen them do that before the ceasefire came into effect, but we'll have to wait and see this year. However, if a ceasefire does collapse, they may feel that really their only way to guarantee security in northern Israel would be to outright destroy Hezbollah. And that, of course, is much harder than it sounds, because Hezbollah has been preparing for exactly that type of war since 2006, which was the last time Israel invaded Lebanon. This would be a long, brutal, bloody conflict that makes the war in Gaza appear small by comparison. All of that could start really by the end of this month and rage throughout the year of 2025. While the war in Gaza rages on, Egypt has built up a military presence in the Sinai Peninsula beyond the terms of the Camp David Accords. Israel has sent some diplomatic staff to Cairo to discuss the situation with Egypt. They were quite unhappy about this military buildup. Egypt has also been very unhappy about Israeli actions in Gaza, as well as the Israeli seizure of certain border crossings in Gaza. A little known fact about this conflict is that Egypt has actually been the primary supporter of Hamas, not necessarily Iran. And this is something that Viktor on Twitter, as well as Analytica Cambria, and I'll have both of their Twitters linked down in the video description. They've talked a lot about this since the wars began. I highly recommend you go follow both of them. Speaking of interstate conflicts in the Middle East between Israel and another country, tensions have really picked up between Israel and and Turkey, especially over Syria. In fact, Benjamin Netanyahu warned the Security Cabinet that Israel may have to prepare for a war with Turkey in the future. Which, boy, if you had that on your bingo card, I mean, good for you. So these are two areas that we'll have to monitor in 2025 for sure. Israel still needs to balance Iran. And with Trump coming into office at the end of this month, Israel will have more opportunities than ever in 2025. There's been reporting that the Trump team has already been considering launching strikes on Iran as soon as they enter office, specifically on Iran's nuclear program. Israel may just choose to beat the U.S. to the punch by striking the nuclear program on their own, especially if they don't have the U.S. holding them back as they have before. This, of course, could potentially spark a larger regional war between Israel and Iran if Iran chooses to respond to that in kind in a significant fashion as they have before. Now, no, we haven't seen larger regional wars pick up from the past exchanges between Israel and Iran. However, Israel has been very picky with its target selection in Iran thus far, and Iran is really not wanting to have a conflict with neither the U.S. or Israel, so that might be why we don't necessarily see a conflict between the two, but we'll just have to wait and see. It really is up to the Ayatollah and what he's willing to lose. 2024 ended with the Assad regime falling, but could 2025 bring about the end of the Ayatollah as well? Remember that Russia is also very dependent on Iranian assistance for the war in Ukraine, and there are a lot of stakeholders in this conflict, not just in the Middle East. So things could get very nasty very fast. And that takes us to Syria, which, boy, is another complicated mess that 2025 will certainly bring more attention to. With Assad gone, it's effectively HTS in the south and the western half of Syria, the Kurds in the eastern and northern half, as well as ISIS dotted around Mad Maxing in the desert, and the Turks in the northern part of Syria now launching attacks on Kurdish-held territories. Oh yeah, and the U.S. is still deployed into Syria right now on an anti-ISIS mission, so they're certainly caught in the middle of a lot of this fighting. Oh yeah, and Israel also launched another attack to take over a new section of buffer zone in southern Syria since the Assad government collapsed. So who exactly is going to win the Syrian sweepstakes? Or will Syria really just shatter and become HTS-held Syria down in the south and the west, and then a new independent Kurdistan in the north and the east? Well, we'll be watching that and seeing how that shakes out this year. Now, if all this wasn't complicated enough, we've also got President Trump taking office here on January 20th of this year. And as with every inauguration, it'll bring a lot of attention from other world leaders, and it will matter not only for the world, but obviously here in the United States. What will Trump do about Ukraine? What will Trump do about China? What will Trump do about the Middle East? Well, it turns out Trump's team is analyzing options for not only potential strikes on Iran, but also looking into a small, cheeky little invasion of Mexico. Mexico's become a pretty big focus for the Republican Party, especially with illegal immigration on the ballot and with the fentanyl epidemic going on. This has caused a lot of Republicans to wonder why the Mexican government is not doing more on its own to curb illegal immigration and fentanyl. And well, the answer is certainly cartels. If you look at the size and capabilities of some of these cartels, they really rival a lot of terrorist organizations in the Middle East. Cartels not only produce and push drugs north, they also facilitate the movement of illegal immigrants into the United States. That's another profit-driving enterprise for them. Obviously, the situation in Mexico politically is incredibly complicated, and so this has prompted a lot of Republicans to feel that maybe the U.S. just needs to take matters into its own hands and perhaps go full Sicario and chop up a part of the Mexican border. This, of course, would not be the first time that the U.S. has invaded Mexico. The U.S. and Mexico were at war, and the U.S. took Mexico City back in the mid-1800s, and that is what allowed the United States to really expand all the way out to California. This is a very interesting history. If you're a history nerd like me, you get different kinds of stories and parts of history where you have people that would later become Confederate generals fighting, of course, for the United States at the time and having these pretty heroic moments in these famous battles. It's just kind of interesting how that happens. Trump has also reopened the conversation about purchasing Greenland. And hilariously, Greenland's prime minister has also voiced a desire to become independent from Denmark. Whether or not this is something that will pave the way for a U.S. purchase of Greenland, who knows? But the timing is certainly impeccable. Trump is not the first president to consider purchasing Greenland. In fact, in 1946, Harry Truman offered Denmark $100 million, which today is $1.6 billion, to buy Greenland. And it's not necessarily a dumb idea. Greenland has a very strategic position, not only in the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean, where it can facilitate a lot of trade between Europe and North America, but it's also right on the Arctic Circle. And it would give the U.S. primary real estate to become a major stakeholder and role player in the Arctic Circle. The U.S. already has military bases in Greenland, so it's not exactly like we desperately need Greenland. We already have a footprint in Greenland that operates for early warning for incoming missiles and bombers, as well as other kinds of Arctic missions. However, economically, Greenland has a lot of rare earth elements and oil, and that's not something that the U.S. can really exploit if we don't buy it. And of course, exploiting oil and rare earth minerals has been something that Trump has been very vocal about exploiting during the campaign trail. But perhaps the most concerning thing to us Americans with the incoming Trump administration for 2025 will be the threat of domestic instability and, of course, the economy. His first term proved pretty divisive, and he himself is a pretty divisive figure. I don't think that that's a controversial thing to say. His second term may embolden some domestic extremist groups to behave more publicly, as some of them did during the first term, whether that's far-right groups or far-left groups. People will also be very closely monitoring the economy and economic improvement in their own lives under his term. After all, that's kind of what he was elected on. If he fails to improve the economic conditions for most Americans, then we could see a lot of issues. While a lot of economic experts have placed the risk of a recession in 2025 to pretty low, a significant disruption in international trade from, say, a global conflict could definitely skyrocket that risk of a U.S. recession. Like, say, a war over Taiwan, a major war in Europe that expands beyond where it currently is, or a war in the Middle East that threatens the Bab el-Mandeb Strait or the Strait of Hormuz. We've already discussed 3 of those conflicts in depth in this video and how those are very real threats. And if economic hardship is brought on and really exacerbated here in the United States, we might see a lot of large-scale protests, protesting, government policies, especially if we're involved in a war, or even worse, if we start a war. And those protests could lead, of course, to riots, as well as actions by those extremist groups coming out either for or against the protest groups. Trump, in his first term, took a very hardline stance against protests and rioting, and he may feel like he has to retaliate. And all of that potentially begins this year, starting January 20th. Overall, 2025 is a very big and consequential year, not just for the US, but for the world. 2 major wars are already raging on and will face major decision points for all the combatants and stakeholders in the coming year. And one war hasn't exactly started yet, but it's definitely on the table should China decide that now is the time. Growing up, my family and I would always joke that if the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, then the world would end. Of course, at that time, the Chiefs were a very bad football team at worst to a mid-football team at best. Whenever they got Mahomes and they won their first Super Bowl, what happened afterwards? COVID hit. A couple years went by, COVID came and went, and the Chiefs won yet another Super Bowl in 2022. By that time, Russia had already began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, so I don't know if we can necessarily give the Chiefs credit for that, but it did reach its 1-year anniversary after the Chiefs' victory. Several months later, October 7th happened though. The next year, the Chiefs won back-to-back Super Bowls, which was the first time any team had ever done that since the 03-04 Patriots. Not too long after they did that, Israel and Iran started directly exchanging blows. Now the Chiefs have the opportunity to do a thing that no NFL team has ever done in NFL history, and that's getting a three-peat, winning 3 Super Bowls back-to-back-to-back. My bet is that should they do this, that either immediately triggers a war in Taiwan or some sort of massive invasion of either Mexico or Iran. In either case, if the Chiefs win the Super Bowl, keep your eyes on the headlines because something bad's going to happen. That's just my own little pet conspiracy theory about 2025, and hopefully that kind of somewhat lightens the mood from this already dark and heavy video. Let me know your pet conspiracy theory down in the comments below, and what do you think is going to happen in 2025? What do you think of any of these conflicts that we've discussed, and what do you think the risks, and give me some positives as well. What are your goals for 2025 as well? Are you ready for this year? Leave a like if you found this video to be helpful or informative. Subscribe to this channel if you want more analysis on global conflicts. Obviously, we talk about that a lot. And I will see you all next time. Later.